saying, well, MLK would say, this is what he said.
Your love is rated X. That means you're extraordinary.
What's up, everyone? It's Afro Angie for Kingdom and Community, and today I'm going to be doing a review of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community in Light of Martin Luther King Day. Please excuse my voice, I'm slightly congested, but it's okay, we still gonna get to it, and I hope that this video will be very educational and informing for you all. I for sure learned a lot about Dr. King. I actually got this book because growing up, we are all taught to love Dr. King and his legacy. And really for me, when the Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown issues were happening, I began to see more people share Malcolm X's thought processes and his speeches, and I started to think, okay, I kind of agree more with Malcolm X, and I started kind of seeing Dr. King in like a really weak light. Just being honest, I was like, why didn't he tell the truth? Why didn't he fight for the things that Malcolm X was fighting for? And reading this book really taught me that he actually was fighting for the same things. He just had different mannerisms and ways to go about it, and I still didn't really agree with that, but through this book I kind of understand his perspective, and I have a whole new respect for him. Before we get into all of the good stuff, I need you to go ahead and like and subscribe. You know you want to see more of these videos, so just go ahead and join the Afro Angie family. First things first, I'm going to give you guys just like a few facts that you may or may not have already known about Dr. King, things that may have been misconstrued through the media and through our school education. One of the biggest things that I remember learning in school is that he died before he got to see his dream come true. And in some ways that is accurate because, of course, you know, relations weren't just completely perfect at that point, but two things had already happened before he was assassinated. The 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed, which desegregated schools and public places, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 had also passed. So two of the major things that we saw through the marches and the protests, the peaceful protests, those goals were already achieved. He didn't die until 1968, and another thing that you may or may not have known is that he did not die on the balcony. He died in the hospital room. There are claims that he was killed by the doctor or the nurses. He was suffocated by a pillow, and while there is no cold, hard evidence for those claims, in 1999, a Memphis jury ruled that local, state, and federal governments were liable for King's death. Now, something that is weird is there's supposed to be a full report of this on the King Center website, but when I clicked on it, it's no longer found. I don't know about you, but that makes me wonder, what are they trying to hide? Another very interesting thing about Dr. King that I actually did learn this in school. Dr. King actually was madly in love with a white woman in college. He met her, she was an art student. There are actually a lot of stories, not only by this lady, her name is Betty Moitz, but by his friends and colleagues that were on campus at the time. He unfortunately decided to end this crazy love affair because he thought that he would not have been as impactful when he was moving to the South to fight for these issues. Honestly, that may explain why he was not very faithful in his relationship with Coretta Scott King. As movies and other things have already shown, he did struggle in that area of his marriage, really truly loving his wife, and maybe it's because she wasn't his true love. He learned the tactic of nonviolence when he read Henry David Thoreau's Essay on Civil Disobedience while he was a freshman at Morehouse. If you see me looking down, it's because I'm reading off this clipboard because there's so much information. I want to make sure it's correct for you guys. But this is when he truly decided to take on the conviction of nonviolence, and it was fortified by Gandhi's example. He thought that Gandhi and the things that he was doing in India showed that Christ's love could also be a powerful force for social change. On pages 84 through 88 of Stride Toward Freedom, he explains his 6 pillars, if you will, of nonviolence. The 6th and final principle is nonviolent resistors must have deep faith in the future because the universe is always on the side of justice. This is the last book that he wrote before he passed. Copyrighted in 1968, so I'm not sure if he wrote it that year or what. Anyway, One of the first things he talks about is, again, the Civil Rights Act had already been passed and the Voting Rights Act had already been passed, and yet he was still fighting for true equality, true equity. He describes the paths of the Negro and white unity that had been converging, crossed as Selma, like a giant X, began to diverge again. So there was like a whole lot of unity until Selma, until the Voting Rights Act, and then after that, there were still issues that needed to be solved, but he began to diverge again. I think that he was truly frustrated with just how apathetic people have become to what he was truly trying to get done. After the 1964 and 1965 acts had been passed, he began to move from black and white relations to true economic equity, and he did stand strong on his conviction that black Americans did deserve reparations, something that I did not know. But in the meantime, he thought it was more important to fight for equity of all poor people, not just black poor people, but all poor people. He was annoyed because he was no longer having that support he had before. Another thing that I really loved about Dr. King that I learned in this book is he really critiqued those the black people who didn't really care about the movement. He also critiqued the church, something that I found myself doing a lot after the Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown situations. I began to think, why does nobody else care about this? Why is the church not equipping us? He was doing the same thing. People will always, we see this every year, it makes me so mad, but until I really read this book, I couldn't disagree. People will try to take Martin Luther King Jr.'s words and say, if he were here, he would this, and like, really, you can't say that because really, y'all killed him. He didn't die for this, he was killed. But on page 22, he says, yet the average white person also has a responsibility. He has to resist the impulse to seize upon the rioter as the exclusive villain. He has to rise up with indignation against his own municipal, state, and national governments to demand that the necessary reforms be instituted which alone will protect him. If he reserves his resentment only for the Negro, he will be the victim by allowing those who have the greatest culpability to evade responsibility. I'm gonna tell you now, he used some pretty big words, and I like big words, but some of these I had to look up, so you might have to look these up as well. But what he was basically saying, which I brought this up because during the Black Lives Matter movement of our generation, a lot of people were saying, Martin Luther King, if he were alive, he would be disgusted and da 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 da. Well, he was saying in that statement that we can't just blame the rioters. It's twofold. You can be upset with them, but also look at yourself and see, are you really doing what you have to do to make their issues, to make their concerns heard? And now I'm going to talk about the other movement that was going on in the latter part of his life, was the Black Power movement. Dr. Martin Luther King critiqued this movement very heavily, just being very honest. Sometimes I wonder if there was like a little bit of jealousy, because when this movement happened, again, desegregation had already started to happen, but in the North is where the Black Power movement was really like prevalent. And the Black Panthers, they were in Chicago, California, you know, up in the North, whereas like the previous issues were fought in the South. And because Black Power was so new, but it was growing so rapidly, I kind of wonder if like Martin Luther King, he was definitely disappointed, but I wonder if there was almost some jealousy because he really critiques them. One of the reasons he did not agree with it, one of the biggest reasons, is because on page 30, he says, it was my contention that a leader has to be concerned about the problems of semantics. Even though he really critiqued the people in this movement, he truly did understand where they were coming from, but he did know that the slogan alone was turning off so many people, it was almost counterproductive. He worked closely with Stokely Carmichael and Floyd McKissick, but once the Black Power movement began to emerge, they too decided to question nonviolence. I think they were just tired, right? Like, we've been fighting for a whole decade and we're still going through these issues. Maybe we should try another route. And I think that there was some validity in the route of the Black Power movement. We saw that the Black Panthers had the breakfast feeding programs and things that have inspired the WIG program that we see today. So he could kind of understand that they were fed up too, but his conviction was just so strong he couldn't let it go. He also understood the frustrations with the nonviolence movement because he himself was really annoyed with the Vietnam War because, as I said, he had changed from fighting for black rights alone to fighting for eradicating poverty, and he was annoyed that so much money was being spent for this war where he felt like we had no business being over there in the first place. I agree, like all wars. But anyway, But he was annoyed that that money was going to the war, but when it came time to take care of the people who were poor here at home, nothing was being done. And so on page 36 he says, and they wonder, referring to the Black Power people, what kind of nation it is that applauds nonviolence whenever Negroes face white people in the streets of the United States, but then applauds violence and burning and death when these same Negroes are sent to the fields of Vietnam. When I read this is when I first was like, maybe he kind of knew what he was talking about, because I remember when the Black Lives Matter movement was really prominent, being annoyed with people in my hometown who would, in the same breath that they would condemn the protesters in the Black Lives Matter movement, support the troops in these random wars. They would like bash ISIS. Don't get me wrong, I don't support any terrorists, but I remember thinking, you don't care about the violence that's being done here in the States, but you want me to care about what's going on in the Middle East. He also critiques the Negro middle class. Page 37, it is a disappointment with the Negro middle class that has sailed or struggled out of the muddy ponds into the relatively fresh flowing waters of the mainstream, and in the process has forgotten the stench of the backwaters where their brothers are still drowning. And I agree. So many times we talk about like black excellence, we talk about black excellence as it refers to individual people who have made it out. And I am very proud to see that more and more people who look like me are in positions of power, of authority, but it's not enough. And too many of us that make it out want to turn our noses up at those who are from where we're from. It's not fair to turn your nose at people who are still going through what they're going through because you were fortunate enough to make it out. And I like the fact that MLK was able to critique them because he himself was from a relatively middle class family for the time that he was, you know, in his life in the 60s. Paraphrase 40 and 41. He was talking about the ways that we were made to like hate ourselves and things of that nature. Something that I didn't know he talked about. You hear about that from Malcolm X, but not from MLK. And on page 44, he goes on to say, to offset this cultural homicide, the Negro must rise up with an affirmation of his own Olympian manhood. Any movement for the Negro's freedom that overlooks this necessity is only waiting to be buried. As long as the mind is enslaved, the body can never be free. And for those of you who are, you know what I'm saying, Afro Angie family supporters 100%, want that wow, you know that I often talk about Black beauty. It's actually in my 3 pillars because of this reason. I think it's hard to really have a passion for the mission, for the movement, if you really don't have a passion for yourself. So I often will talk about like natural hair or natural looking hair, or you know, just Black beauty in general, because I think once we see ourselves as beautiful, we begin to know our worth. And once we begin to know our worth, we can start to fight for things that we actually deserve. But here comes his criticism of the Black Power movement. On page 45, he says, beneath all the satisfaction of a gratifying slogan, Black Power is a nihilistic philosophy born out of the conviction that the Negro can't win. Although this thinking is understandable as a response to white power structure that never completely committed itself to the true equality of the Negro, and a die-hard mentality that sought to shut all windows and doors against the winds of change, it nonetheless carries the seeds of its own doom. Page 47, he also says, we Negroes who have dreamed for so long of freedom are still confined in a prison of segregation and discrimination. Must we respond with bitterness and cynicism? Certainly not, for this can lead to Black anger so desperate that it ends in Black suicide. More to elaborate on that point, on page 60, this is when I really was like, okay, MLK, you know what you're talking about, you know what you're talking about. No internal revolution has ever succeeded in overthrowing a government by violence unless the government has already lost the allegiance and effective control of its armed forces. But anyone in his right mind knows that this will not happen in the United States. Furthermore, few, if any, which is a good point, only a few violent revolutions for the people have been successful unless the violent minority had the sympathy and support of the non-resisting majority. Castro may have had only a few Cubans actually fighting with him, but he would never have overthrown the Batista regime unless he had the sympathy of the vast majority of the Cuban people. This is when I really was like, okay, he's right. Because Black Americans, Black people period, minorities period, are the minority. And a lot of times we kind of are fighting by ourselves, even though we have like the sympathy and support of other groups. They won't really directly fight with us because they still benefit from the same things that we're fighting against, and write about how Black power sometimes can be seen as like a call for Black suicide because we just don't have the numbers on our side to fight for it. And hold on to this thought. At the very end of this video, I'm going to read the most powerful quote he said in this book about integration, and it's all going to make sense, especially if you're a Christian. He also critiques Black politicians on page 50. I think this is important to bring up because a lot of times when we see like Black politicians that are in office, we say this is what MLK died for, but on page 50 he says Negro politicians can be as opportunistic as their white counterparts if there is not an informed and determined constituency demanding social reform. So like basically like we can't just trust them just because they're Black, and I agree. So some of these politicians that we're saying Black excellence, yeah, this is what MLK died for. Page 95, he also says it is important, however, to understand that giving a man his due may often mean giving him special treatment. A society that has done something special against the Negro for hundreds of years must now do something special for him in order to equip him to compete on a just and equal basis. On page 63, he goes to give others' opinions of the word integration and how they felt about it. James Baldwin said, if the word integration means anything, it means that we, with love, shall force our brothers to see themselves as they are and to cease fleeing from reality and begin to change it. Meaning, those who are for racism, he was saying, well, you have to force them to like love us and like stop trying to run from reality and just to change the brutal reality, which is that there wasn't enough love. Thought that was a really good introspective quote. But someone that I kind of agree with is Mr. John Killens. He wrote in the Negro Digest, integration comes after liberation. A slave cannot integrate with his master. The oppressed fights to free himself from his oppressor, not to integrate with him. Integration is the step after freedom, when the freed man makes up his mind as to whether he wishes to integrate with his former master. Of course, Dr. King didn't quite agree with this, but that makes a lot of sense to me. However, King's critique of that also makes sense to me. On page 64, he says, on the one hand, integration is the true intergroup, interpersonal living, but on the other hand, it is the mutual sharing of power. So that tells me that the way that we refer to King's integration is kind of just like a kumbaya, let's hold hands, let's, just be friends. But he was trying to make us integrate because we needed to integrate that power. The decision to really speak and think for ourselves only comes with integrating power. And so that's something that I really didn't know. I didn't learn about that in school. Page 94 and 95, he begins to critique, or not critique, but challenge the white liberal, those who are saying, I'm not racist, I have Black friends. He says, he quotes Edmund Burke. He kind of gets his inspiration from Edmund Burke. He says, when evil men plot, good men must plan. When evil men burn and bomb, good men must build and bind. So it's kind of like when during the All Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter thing, people would say there are good cops and bad cops. So I think here he was saying, okay, well, if there's good cops and bad cops, it's not enough just to be neutral when there's bad cops. You got to be the opposite of what the bad cops are doing. So there's people out here that are plotting, then you got to be with us and you got to plan with us. People out there that are burning and bombing, you got to build with us and you got to bind with us. You know what I mean? And I think that that's a really good statement for those who are saying, well, MLK would say, this is what he said. And on page 95, he said, the white liberal must see the Negro needs not only love, but also justice. Love that does not satisfy justice is no love at all. So, like, you can't actively love someone and not care about what they're going through. You can't actively, really just be there for somebody and let the things that were happening happen to them. But yeah, on page 102, the good minister, MLK, said the church as a whole has been too negligent on the question of civil rights. Y'all, let me find this other quote because he went in on these folks. Page 159, he says, but toward those churches that shun and evade the issue, that are mute or timorous on social and economic questions, we are no better strangers, even though we sing the same hymns and worship of the same God. Like, when I read that, I was like, wow. Like, This man was non-violent, but he was about it. He wasn't out here playing with these folks. He was letting them know, hey, get it together. You need to speak up on these issues. And honestly, this message can still be applied to a lot of these churches today. I'm just saying. There's so much. I'm gonna wrap it up with how he felt about the black family. Some of the situations that like we see the black family isn't really like together. We see a lot of issues and like, we have a lot of toxic relatives, a lot of things that haven't been said, but it's really because we've never really just had a stable family unit. He begins to talk about how the Middle Passage was so long and expensive. African families were just torn apart in the interest of selectivity. So like if you were the best looking in terms of how hard you could work, no matter if you had a family or a mom or whatever, you would just come and they would have to stay behind. That was like the first strike. Then on the plantation, it was illegal for slaves to marry. They would breed them like dogs so that it was more lucrative for those who already owned the slaves, and then they would like sell those, or they would even lease the babies. Like you can have this slave for a certain amount of time, just continuing to disrupt the unity. The black mothers, usually because they would have to take care of the white master's children, they got to be in the house, and sometimes they were able to be a little bit more educated, and that, he believes, is how matriarchy developed early. As things changed and they were able to get jobs, the woman's education led her to get jobs more easily. That's how the woman being the provider of the household was formed. Not that there's anything wrong with that. You know, I was raised by a very strong mom myself, but nuclear families do prove time and time again that that's the best way to build and retain wealth, even for psychological things in a child's development. You can say what you want to say, but studies have shown that there's proof in that. Roles have to be played, and a lot of times due to slavery, we've never had the chance. A lot of times, I know there's a lot of exceptions, but we've never really had the chance as a community to have that. It talks about toxic masculinity. It talks about how because the black father didn't have the education, he didn't really know about the bigger cities, his rage and torment turned inward, and he began to beat his wife and beat his children. Though we have been scarred, we have submerged, we still struggle to survive. Like, we ain't dead yet, is basically what he was trying to say. But at the end of the day, to really sum up how he felt about integration and how passionate he was about it, again, something that I didn't quite understand at first, was that he didn't just want us to integrate to the way things were, but through our integration create a new society. He says on page 142, "Let us therefore not think of our movement as one that seeks to integrate the Negro into all the existing values of the American society. Let us be those creative dissenters who will call our beloved nation to a higher destiny, to a new plateau of compassion, and to a more noble expression of humaneness." In a nutshell, that's really what he was fighting for. And to integrate, not just to be friends and not just to have peace, but to have power, to have a way to speak for ourselves and demand what we truly deserve. I gained a whole new respect for this man, and I really think that a lot of us have seen his message be construed and distorted, but what we think he was fighting for was he was fighting for something way, way deeper than that. And I encourage those of you who have enjoyed this video to order this book. If you're like me, probably thinking, man, all the same stuff he was fighting for, we're still seeing today. But something that he really also clung to was it's okay to accept disappointments, to accept finite disappointments, but also to steadfastly cling to hope. You have a new understanding of exactly what MLK was trying to say. I hope that you will look more into some of the myths or some of the things we were taught in school. But more importantly, I hope that you will take on his heart and his message and try to do something impactful for your own community that is something that you can really stand behind, something that your vision can support. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share, and I will see you on the next one.